The Life of Dwight L. Moody. Chapter 23. Return to America. The reports of the deep religious awakening in Great Britain had preceded Mr. Moody to America, so that on his return he was as well known there as in Great Britain. A little over 2 years before he had left his country, known only to a comparatively small circle of Sunday school workers and Young Men's Christian Association friends. In Chicago, his name was more prominent than elsewhere, but to the general public his work was not familiar. It may be said, then, that Mr. Moody was introduced to America by Great Britain, as he in turn is said to have introduced several Englishmen to their own country. Immediately on his return, he received many invitations to visit the leading cities in America. In some cases, they were sent to him before he left London. In several places, committees had been formed to arrange for a series of meetings which he was asked to conduct. It must have been most gratifying as well as flattering to find at once such a widespread expression of appreciation. But with a characteristic spirit of humility, he turned aside from all these invitations obstinately to rest, but in reality to study and to wait upon God for guidance as to his future plans. On arriving in New York, Mr. Moody with his family went directly to Northfield to spend several weeks with his aged mother. Here he gave much time to a careful preparation for the work of the coming winter. Mornings were devoted to reading and the preparation of addresses, as he had had little opportunity during the busy months abroad to acquire new material. It was at this time that he purchased the small farm which later became his home. A barren little tract of 12 acres near his mother's place was offered for sale at this time at a moderate price, and Mr. Moody bought this, purposing to hold the land for his mother and to spend a few summers there for the sake of his children. For several summers he retreated to the quiet seclusion of this country home, where he could study and prepare for the arduous missions during the winter months. Gradually his interest in Northfield increased, until the home he planned for rest and quiet became the scene of his greatest activities and most lasting work. Soon after arriving at Northfield, he was again besieged with the most cordial and urgent invitations to visit different American cities. Among others was one from Washington brought by the Reverend Dr. John P Newman, who was delegated by the pastors of that city to go to Northfield and secure a positive answer to the question, "Will you conduct a campaign in Washington this fall?" Dr. Newman found Mr. Moody busily engaged in farm duties. He listened attentively to the distinguished preacher, later a bishop of the Methodist Episcopal Church, but he was not prepared to give a definite answer. "I don't know yet where the first meetings will be held. I am waiting to see where I am led." This was all that he could be introduced to say. Dr. Tyler of Brooklyn also visited Northfield to hear from Mr. Moody's own lips the thrilling story of what God had wrought in Great Britain. The two friends talked frankly of their meetings abroad and of those soon to begin in America. At the farmhouse table at his veteran mother, wrote Dr. Tyler, he related some of the experiences. When I asked him who had helped him most, he replied, "Dr. Andrew A. Bonard and Lord Cairns. The first one helped me by inspiring hints of Bible truth for my sermons, the other one by coming often to hear me. For the people said that if the Lord Chancellor came to my meetings, they had better come too." He might have added, if his characteristic modesty had allowed, that Cairns had said that he gave him a new conception of preaching. The next morning, Moody told me that as he had had but few educational advantages in his boyhood, he was thinking of starting a school of a decided Christian character for girls and boys in Northfield, and lo, into what a goodly tree has that seed thought grown, and how God has watered it. Many other reminiscences crowd upon me, but I restrain my pen, for if all my friends should tell all they know, a volume would swell into a library. Of one thing I feel sure, that is, if another book of the Acts of Christ's faithful apostles were to be written, probably the largest space in the record of the 19th century would be given to the soul-winning work of Charles H. Spurgeon and Dwight L. Moody. Another visitor who gave and received a great blessing from Major Whittle, his former associate and lifelong fellow worker. Several years before, while walking home from a meeting in his tabernacle in Chicago, stopping near a lamp-post where their ways were to part. Mr. Moody opened his Bible to 2 Timothy 4, and in reply to something his friend had said as to what could be done to rouse the people, read, "Preach the word, be instant in season, out of season, reprove, rebuke, exhort with all long-suffering and doctrine," adding, "This is our commission, Whittle." Nothing more was said then, but there came to his friend the conviction, which never from that time left him, that God might call him to some form of gospel work. "As I look back now," writes Major Whittle, "it was a wonderful manifestation of the presence of the Spirit of God, and I bless him for his goodness in sending the call through Mr. Moody to me." The following extract from Major Whittle's diary of September 1875 gives a picture of the daily life at Northfield during the preparation for his first gospel campaign in this country. "Bliss and myself received a letter from dear Moody to come at once to Northfield, Massachusetts, and confer with him about the work for the coming winter. We left Chicago together on Monday evening, September 6th, arrived at South Vernon, Vermont, Wednesday noon. Dear Moody was at the station with a carriage to meet us, and received us with such joy. Over 2 years ago, we parted with him in Chicago. Since that time, he has been used to arouse the Christian world, to lead thousands of souls to Christ, and to stimulate scores, as he did in the cases of Bliss and myself, to go out into the vineyard. I love him and revere him as I do no other man on earth. To me, he has seemed for years a man full of the Holy Ghost. The only change I see in him now is a growth of conscious power and an ability for speaking with an added weight and deeper conviction. He is wholly and thoroughly conscious that it is all of God. Praying alone with him, I found him humble as a child before God. Out in the work with him, I found him bold as a lion before men. No hesitation, no shrinking, no timidity. Speaking with authority, speaking as an ambassador of the Most High God. 2 weeks we passed in this beautiful mountain home of our brother. We met his widowed mother, his 3 brothers, his wife and children. We were made part of the family and taken over all the haunts of the Moody's boyhood. Up the mountains where he used to pasture the cows and pick the berries and gather chestnuts, and where he passed the last Sunday alone with God before he sailed for England upon his last memorable visit. We went with him to take dinner with his uncle Cyrus over the Connecticut River, and as we were crossing the beautiful stream, the valley sloping down on either side, and the blue hills and mountains beyond, Bliss and Sankey sang together, only waiting for the boatman, and There is a Land of Pure Delight. Moody was helping the ferryman. We all thought the crossing very slow. After the third or fourth song, Sankey looked around, discovered Moody, holding on to the water and pulling back while the ferryman pulled forward, his object being to get in a good many songs, not only for his own enjoyment, but for the good of the ferryman, a boyhood friend for whose conversion he was interested. Moody greatly enjoyed Sankey's discomfort, and after a hearty laugh from us all, we joined in his song, Pull for the Shore, and by keeping a watch on Moody, reached the shore as we closed. One beautiful day, we took luncheon in baskets and driving out 4 or 5 miles, climbed the highest of the hills and had a picnic on its top. We could see for miles up and down the Connecticut Valley. The village of Northfield was at our feet. Brattleboro was just at the north, and all around us grand old granite mountains. Mount Monadnock, Monadnock, the largest of these was at our right as we faced the valley. Upon this mountain, Moody asked which of the mountains of the Bible was dearest to us. His was the mountain in Galilee where Christ met the disciples after he had risen. Matthew 28, verse 16. Bliss and Sankey both chose the Mount of Transfiguration. Samuel, Moody, the place where Christ preached his sermon. George Davis, Calvary. My own choice, Olivet. We had a precious season of prayer upon this mount, asking for power for the work before us, and praising the same Lord for meeting us here, who met his disciples in Galilee. I spent the rest of the day with Moody driving up the valley to Warwick, a most beautiful ride, and back to Northfield. Moody told me much of his experience in Great Britain. I asked him if he was never overcome by nervousness and timidity because of the position in which he said. He said no, that God carried him right along as the work grew. He had no doubt that Had he known when he reached England what was before him, he would have been frightened. But as he looked back, all he could think of was Jeremiah's experience, that God gave him a forehead of brass to go before the people. He had such a consciousness of the presence of God in his meetings in London that the people, lords, bishops, ministers, and whoever they are, were like grasshoppers. It troubled him somewhat in going to London that his sermons and Bible talks would be all reported, and his entire stock, the same that he had used in other places, would thus be examined. But as he expressed it, there was no help for it, so I just shut my eyes and went ahead, leaving it with God. He told me he spent but comparatively little time in secret prayer, and had no experience of being weighted down and burdened before God. He did not try to get into that state. His work kept him in the spirit of prayer and dependency upon God, and he just gave himself wholly to the work. For a year or more before he left Chicago, he was continually burdened and crying to God for more power. Then he was always wanting to get a few people together for half a day of prayer, and would groan and weep before God for the baptism of the Spirit. He did not seem to be in this state now. I wanted such a season while with him, feeling my own need, but he was as one who had passed through that experience and had just put himself wholly in God's hands, received the baptism of the Holy Ghost, and was being led in all things by him. His prayers, while I was with him, were as simple as a child's, full of trust, humility, and expectation that God would not disappoint him. There seemed to me an understanding established between the servants and the master, which made long prayers or the importunity of repetitiveness unnecessary. During our stay with Moody, services were held in the Congregational Church every night with very blessed results. The whole population attended, and hundreds came from surrounding towns. Dear Moody's mother and 2 brothers, connected with the Unitarian Church, were much blessed. I should always thank God for the blessed experience of these 2 weeks. Many brethren from different parts of the country came and went while we were there, among them Stout of Philadelphia, Rowland, Dodge, and McBurney of New York, Remington of Fall Hill, Moore of Boston, Fairbanks of Vermont, and others. While together we arranged for the combination of hymns for our common use, we all agreed that it would be best to distribute our forces in different parts of the country and not to be in the same locality. Nothing was more characteristic of Moody than his longing for retirement in the country from the press of his work. Though his life work lay for the most part in great cities, he was born a country lad, and for him the everlasting hills possessed a wealth of meaning and marvelous recuperative power. Some instinct drew him back to the soil. Some mysterious prompting impelled him to solitude, away from the crowds that absorbed so much of his strength. Then after a little respite, he would return with new strength and new vitality.